The wind howled like a wounded beast across the plains of Stonehaven Valley, clawing at the weathered boards of Eleanor Thorne's cabin as if determined to pry them loose. Winter had come early that year, more vicious than anyone could remember, burying the scattered homesteads under drifts taller than a man. Eleanor stood at her frost-etched window, watching snow erase the world outside, feeling the cold seep through the cracks despite the fire struggling in her hearth. She pulled her shawl tighter around bony shoulders that had once been strong, shoulders that had carried more than their share of burdens these past 5 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 winters without Matthew, 5 years of fighting the land, alone, of rising before dawn and falling asleep with dirt still under her nails. 5 years of watching other women's husbands return from the fields while the space beside her at church remained empty. The townsfolk called her the Winter Widow, though never to her face. They said the cold had settled in her eyes the day they buried Matthew beneath the old oak, frozen ground unyielding to even the strongest gravediggers. "We should have left when we had the chance," she whispered to the empty room, her breath clouding in the air despite the fire. Matthew had wanted to go west to Oregon's promised fertile valleys, but Eleanor had been afraid of the unknown, afraid of leaving the little they had built. Now she was trapped in a dying homestead, in a valley slowly emptying as families abandoned their dreams to the harsh realities of frontier life. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she moved to check her supplies one final time, though she already knew what she would find. One small sack of grain remained, barely enough to make bread for another week. The cellar held 3 wrinkled potatoes, a half jar of preserved beans, and a handful of dried apples. The storm had come too early, before she could make the journey to Fort Collins for winter provisions, before she could sell the small harvest that now lay buried beneath 6 feet of snow in her barn. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Eleanor froze, her hand instinctively reaching for Matthew's old rifle that hung above the mantel. Nobody traveled in weather like this, nobody except those desperate enough to risk death in the howling white. "Who's there?" she called, voice steady despite the fear flickering in her chest. "Please," came a woman's voice, thin against the storm's rage. "Please, we've lost our way." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before sliding back the wooden bar. The wind nearly tore the door from her hands as she opened it, revealing 3 snow-covered figures huddled on her porch. A woman clutching a bundle to her chest, a man supporting her with an arm around her shoulders, and behind them an older woman bent against the wind. "Get in, quickly," Eleanor commanded, stepping aside. They stumbled in, bringing with them swirling snow and the smell of cold so deep it seemed to have seeped into their very skin. As Eleanor fought to close the door against the wind, she took stock of her unexpected guests. The man was tall, gaunt-faced, with eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond simple tiredness. The younger woman couldn't be more than 20, her face pale beneath her frost-rimmed hood, and the bundle she clutched. Eleanor's heart contracted when she realized it was a child, maybe 3 years old, lips faintly blue. "The stage overturned 5 miles back," the man explained, his voice rough with cold. "Driver said the pass was clear, but the storm caught us. We tried to walk to Hollowbrook, but lost the road." "Hollowbrook is 15 miles south," Eleanor said, already moving to stoke the fire. "You're lucky you found anything at all in this white hell." The older woman, her grey hair escaping from beneath a woolen scarf, studied Eleanor with shrewd eyes. "God guided our steps," she said simply. Eleanor didn't reply. God had stopped guiding anything in her life the day Matthew's horse had returned riderless from the high country. "The child needs warmth," she said instead, gesturing to her bed in the corner. "Get those wet clothes off, all of you. I'll heat some water." As she moved around her small cabin, setting water to boil and pulling out her precious store of extra blankets, Eleanor felt something stir within her, something she had thought long dead. Purpose. For 5 years, she had survived. Just survived, nothing more. Each day the same as the last, each season a trial to endure rather than a gift to embrace. These strangers, with their desperate need, had awakened something she had forgotten existed. The young mother, Sarah, she said her name was, cradled her son close as color slowly returned to his cheeks. Her husband, James, stood awkwardly by the fire, clearly unused to accepting charity. The older woman, Martha, their aunt who had been traveling with them to a new life in Colorado Springs, sat at Eleanor's table with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen worse days and expected to see more. "You saved our lives," James said, quietly, as Eleanor ladled her precious bean soup into 4 bowls, smaller portions than she would have served herself alone, but enough to warm empty bellies. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor replied, placing the last of her cornbread beside each bowl. "We're all trapped now. This storm won't let up for days by the look of it." "We have food in our trunks," Sarah offered hopefully. "If we could somehow retrieve them from the coach." "Nobody's going back out in that," Eleanor cut her off. "Not if they value their lives." Martha's eyes hadn't left Eleanor's face. "You're alone here," she said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "My husband died 5 years ago. Rock slide in the high country. And no children." The familiar pain twisted in Eleanor's chest. "No." The cabin fell silent except for the wind's mournful howl and the crackle of the fire. Eleanor watched as the small family ate, trying not to think about what would happen when the food ran out. 4 people instead of 1. 4 mouths to feed from stores meant for barely 1. "We'll leave as soon as the storm breaks," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "We won't burden you longer than necessary." The boy, Daniel they called him, had fallen asleep on the bed, his breathing finally deep and regular. Eleanor watched the rise and fall of his small chest, remembering how many nights she had lain awake after Matthew's death, wondering if children might have eased the crushing loneliness that followed. "You'll stay until it's safe to travel," she said firmly. "I won't have more deaths on my conscience." Later that night, after her guests had settled into makeshift beds, the women and child on her bed, James on a pallet near the fire, Eleanor sat alone at her table, calculating. Even with strict rationing, they had enough food for perhaps 3 days. The storm showed no signs of breaking, its fury undiminished as midnight approached. She opened the small wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions, Matthew's pocket watch, their marriage certificate, the deed to the land, and wrapped in a square of faded calico, the handful of wheat seed she had saved from her meager harvest. Not to eat, never to eat, but to plant come spring, the last hope for a new beginning. Eleanor ran her fingers over the hard grains, each one a promise, each one a future stalk of wheat, a future loaf of bread, a future chance. She had endured 5 years of solitude for this chance, this hope of self-sufficiency, of proving to the valley, to herself, that she could make it alone. The child coughed in his sleep, a small, vulnerable sound in the darkness. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. "We need to stretch what we have," she announced as the family awoke to a world still blinded by swirling white. She set the last of the cornbread on the table, sliced thin. "1 meal a day, until we see how long this will last." Sarah looked stricken, her eyes darting to her son. "Daniel is still growing," she began. "Which is why he'll get a full portion," Eleanor said, more gently than she had spoken to anyone in years. "The rest of us will manage." On the third day, Eleanor brought out the potatoes from the cellar, wrinkled and sprouting though they were. On the fourth day, they finished the beans. On the fifth, with the storm showing the first faint signs of weakening, she made a thin gruel from the last of her regular grain. That night, when the others slept, Eleanor took out the seed wheat. Again, in the firelight, the grains seemed to glow with possibility, with life. She had protected them through everything, her final tether to a future that kept slipping further away. But now, looking at the sleeping child, at the family that chance had delivered to her door, something shifted in her heart. Morning dawned. Clear on the sixth day, the storm finally spent. The sun glinted blindingly off unbroken white, stretching to the horizon. No roads, no fences, no sign of human life beyond the smoke from her chimney. They were still isolated, still trapped, but now with empty shelves and hungry bellies. Eleanor placed her cooking pot on the stove and poured in water. Then, with hands that trembled only slightly, she unwrapped the seed wheat and poured it in, all of it. The family watched in silence, somehow understanding the significance of the act without being told. "You can't," Sarah whispered, reaching out as if to stop her. "That's your planting seed." Eleanor stirred the pot, not meeting their eyes. "We'll be dead before planting season if we don't eat," she said matter-of-factly. "Besides, there's always next year." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They ate the wheat porridge in reverent silence, each spoonful a sacrifice none of them took lightly. Eleanor found herself watching Daniel as he ate, his small face serious, as if he too understood the gravity of the gift. When he finished, he brought his bowl to her, looking up with solemn eyes. "Thank you for the food, ma'am," he said, the words clearly practiced and prompted by his mother. But then, unprompted, he added, "Mama says you gave us your tomorrow so we could have today." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, not pain, but a breaking free of something that had been frozen for too long. She reached out, hesitantly, and touched the boy's hair. "Sometimes," she said softly, "today is all we can be sure of." That afternoon, Eleanor found herself telling stories she hadn't spoken aloud in years. About Matthew, about their early days on the homestead, about the wildflowers that covered the valley in spring. The family listened, adding tales of their own, of the drought that had driven them from their home in Kansas, of their hopes for a fresh start in Colorado Springs, where James's brother had promised work. "Why do you stay?" Martha asked her, bluntly, as they watched the sun begin its descent on what would surely be their last day of food. Alone in this harsh place. Eleanor looked out the window at the land that had both sustained and punished her. "It was ours," she said simply. "Matthew's and mine, our dream. I couldn't bear to let it die too." That night, huddled around the fire as the temperature dropped with the sun, they spoke of hopes they didn't truly believe in, of rescue that couldn't possibly come in time, of spring that seemed impossibly distant. "Listen," James said suddenly, holding up a hand. In the silence that followed, they heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the settling cold. A jingling, faint but growing stronger. Sleigh bells. Eleanor was first to the door, flinging it open despite the bitter cold. In the moonlight, across the unbroken expanse of snow, came a sight she would remember until her dying day. A line of sleighs, 5 of them, cutting through the drifts like ships through a white sea. Lanterns swung from their posts, creating pools of golden light against the blue-white snow. And behind them, more lights, more movement. "It's the town," she whispered in disbelief. "It's Hollowbrook." The first sleigh pulled up to her porch, its runner slicing through the snow with a sound like tearing silk. The driver, bundled against, The cold was nevertheless immediately recognizable as Sheriff Thomas Wade, his mustache frosted white with his breath. "Ellie Thorne," he called, "you are a hard woman to reach in a blizzard." Eleanor stood speechless as more sleighs arrived, each laden with barrels and sacks. Men she recognized from town, the blacksmith, the banker, farmers from neighboring homesteads, began unloading supplies. Flour, salt pork, coffee, sugar, potatoes, canned goods, firewood. "What is this?" she finally managed as the supplies continued to pile up on her porch. A woman pushed forward through the men, Harriet Miller, who ran the general store with her husband. "News reached us about the stage going missing," she explained, stamping her feet against the cold. "Search. Parties found it yesterday empty. We feared the worst until one of the Parker boys spotted smoke from your chimney. Been trying to get through ever since." "But this," Eleanor gestured to the mountain of supplies still being unloaded, "this is more than just rescue." "Sheriff." Wade looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Truth is, Ellie, folks in town have been worried about you. Not just now, but for years. We should have checked in more, especially with winter coming on hard as it did." Harriet nodded. "We took up a collection. Everyone gave something, figured it was long overdue." Eleanor felt Martha's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. The older woman leaned close and whispered, "It seems you weren't as alone as you thought." As the town unloaded the last of the supplies, more explanations came. How they'd been trying to organize help for her even before the blizzard hit. How the minister's wife had been planning to ride out once the first snow settled. How they'd all assumed someone else was checking on the widow Thorne, only to discover no one had been. "We failed you," the blacksmith Silas said gruffly. "Won't happen again." Among the supplies was a special package, seed wheat from 3 different farms, enough to plant twice what Eleanor had sacrificed. "For spring," Harriet explained. "Parker's boy told us what he saw through your window, what you did for these folks." James and Sarah stood in the doorway, Daniel half asleep in his father's arms despite the excitement. "She saved us," Sarah told the gathered townspeople. "Gave everything she had." Sheriff Wade looked at Eleanor with new respect. "That doesn't surprise any of us who knew Matthew. He always said you were the stronger one." As the visitors prepared to leave, promising to return in 2 days to help clear a path to town, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people for the first time in years. Not just the family she had saved, but neighbors who had finally remembered their duty to one another. The winter that had threatened to take everything had instead given her back something she had lost long before Matthew's death: community. Later, as the house settled into quiet again, now warm, full of food, and somehow less lonely, even with the same broken boards and drafty windows, Martha sat beside Eleanor at the table. "You know," the older woman said thoughtfully, "we still need to get to Colorado Springs eventually. But I find myself wondering if there might be opportunities here in Stonehaven Valley for a family looking to put down roots." Eleanor looked at Daniel, sleeping peacefully with a full belly, at Sarah darning a sock by the fire, at James carefully repairing a loose floorboard he had noticed earlier. She thought of the seed wheat, of spring waiting beneath the snow, of fields that needed tending, and a house too big for one person alone. "Stonehaven has its challenges," she said slowly, "but good people make all the difference." Outside, the stars shone in a sky finally clear of clouds, brilliant and close in the way they only can be on the coldest nights. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor looked at them and saw not distant, unreachable light, but a path forward, one she no longer had to walk alone. The morning after the sleighs arrived, Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sound of laughter. Daniel was sitting by the fire with his father, building a tiny fort from kindling sticks. The boy's cheeks had color again, his eyes bright with the resilience only children possess. Sarah hummed as she stirred a pot of real oatmeal. Not the thin gruel of desperation, but proper food with dried apples and the luxury of cinnamon from the supplies the town had brought. Eleanor paused in the doorway of her bedroom, suddenly self-conscious. For years she had moved through her days like a ghost in her own home, speaking aloud only to curse a stubborn nail or comfort a sick animal. Now her cabin pulsed with life, with voices and movement and purpose. "Good morning," Martha said, appearing at her side with a steaming cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute Eleanor had been making do with for months. "First decent sleep I've had since we left Kansas." The old woman's knowing eyes studied Eleanor's face. "It's strange, isn't it? Having people fill up your space after being alone so long." Eleanor nodded, accepting the cup. "Like wearing boots that used to fit," she said quietly. "Takes time to break them in again." Outside, men's voices carried on the clear morning air. Through the front window, Eleanor could see James talking with Sheriff Wade and 2 other men. From town, gesturing toward the barn, half buried in snow. They were making plans, she realized, making decisions about her property without her. The old defensiveness rose in her chest as she strode to the door and stepped outside, not bothering with her shawl despite the bitter cold. Could clear. "The south field first. Once this snow melts," Sheriff Wade was saying. "Get it ready for early planting." "Mrs. Thorne," James said, noticing her approach. "We were just discussing how to help you get this place back in proper working order." Eleanor's chin lifted. "This place is in proper working order." An uncomfortable silence fell. The men exchanged glances, and Eleanor saw it then. The pity, the assumption that she, a lone woman, couldn't possibly have kept things up to standard. Sheriff Wade cleared his throat. "Ellie, we just want to help. Matthew would have—" "Matthew isn't here," she cut him off, her voice sharp as winter air. "And I've managed 5 years without a committee of men deciding what's best for my farm." "Mrs. Thorne," James began, his face earnest, "we're just grateful. We want to repay your kindness." She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. Not just a hungry stranger delivered by the storm, but a man who understood work, who carried his own burdens with dignity, who had swallowed his pride to accept help when his family needed it. "I don't need your gratitude," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But I could use an extra pair of hands when it's time to mend the north fence." A brief smile flickered across James's face. He nodded once, understanding what the concession had cost her. Over the next week, as paths were cleared and the worst of the snow began to settle, a new rhythm established itself at the Thorne homestead. James repaired things Eleanor had been putting off: the sagging porch step, the door that never quite closed properly, the leak in the barn roof. But he always asked first, always deferred to her knowledge of the land and its needs. Sarah organized the cabin with a gentle efficiency that somehow didn't make Eleanor feel invaded. She created space where there seemed to be none, arranged the supplies so they would last, and kept Daniel from underfoot when important work was being done. And Martha simply watched and listened, her weathered hands always busy with mending or cooking, her presence a steady anchor when tensions rose or sadness threatened to pull Eleanor back into her shell of isolation. The second Saturday. After the storm, Harriet Miller came by sleigh with mail and news from town. She sat at Eleanor's table, a sight so unexpected that Eleanor found herself checking that cups were clean and surfaces dusted. "Council's meeting next week to discuss improvements to the northern road," Harriet said, spreading fresh butter on a slice of bread. "Your road, essentially. Miles Everett suggested we should improve it before spring mud season, make it easier for folks to get out here." Eleanor frowned. "That road's been the same since before Matthew and I settled here. Why the sudden interest?" Harriet's usually brisk manner softened. "Because we were wrong, Ellie. When Matthew died, we gave you space, thought that's what you'd want. Then days became weeks, Weeks became months, and somehow we all convinced ourselves you were doing fine on your own. I was, Eleanor said stiffly. Were you? Harriet challenged gently. Really? Or were you just surviving? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable, because both knew the truth. Eleanor had existed, had worked and endured, but that wasn't the same as living. After Harriet left, Eleanor found herself standing before the small mirror over her wash basin, really looking at herself for the first time in years. Her face had grown lean and weathered, lines etched at the corners of her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there in Matthew's time. Her hair, once chestnut brown, now showed threads of silver at the temples. But it was her eyes that gave her pause. They were clearer now, more present than they had been in memory. The dull veil of grief that had clouded them for so long had begun to lift, revealing the woman she had been before, and perhaps a glimpse of who she might yet become. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the newly cleared yard, Eleanor sat on the porch steps watching Daniel chase snowflakes that had begun to fall again, light and playful this time, rather than threatening. "He's a good boy," Martha said, lowering herself onto the step beside Eleanor with a grunt that spoke of aging joints. "Smart, too. Reminds me of my own son at that age, full of questions about everything under the sun." Eleanor watched as the child tried to catch a snowflake on his tongue. "I always wanted children," she said, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "It just never happened for us." Martha's work-worn hand covered hers briefly. "There are many ways to mother," she said. "Not all of them require your own blood." Later that night, long after the others had gone to bed, Eleanor slipped outside again. The moon hung full and heavy above the valley, casting blue shadows across the snow. In that ethereal light, her land looked like something from a dream. Beautiful, pristine, untouched by the struggles that had marked her years here. She walked to the old oak where Matthew lay buried, her boots crunching through the frozen crust. They had put him there because he had loved that tree, loved to sit in its shade in summer and watch the way the light filtered through its leaves. Eleanor hadn't visited in over a year. It had become too painful, too much a reminder of all she had lost. But tonight, standing before the simple wooden marker, she felt something different. Not the sharp, jagged grief that had once threatened to tear her apart, but a gentler ache. A recognition that what had been could never be again, but that didn't mean nothing else could ever be. "I gave away our seed wheat," she told him, her voice quiet in the vast stillness. "You would have done the same. You always said no crop was worth a human life." The oak's bare branches creaked softly in the night breeze, its roots reaching deep beneath the frozen ground, holding firm despite everything winter could throw at it. "I'm not sure what happens next," she continued. "This family, they need a place. I need..." She paused, struggling to name what she had been missing for so long. "I need purpose beyond just surviving another season." As if in answer, the clouds parted further, moonlight illuminating the valley all the way to the distant mountains. Matthews had loved that view, had stood with her on this very spot before they'd built the cabin, before they'd planted their first crop and said, "This is where we'll make our life." Not my life, Eleanor realized, our life. He had always seen their homestead as something larger than just the two of them, a place that would grow and change, that would welcome others, that would be part of a community. Something cold and wet touched her cheek. Eleanor looked up to see snow beginning to fall again, gentle and cleansing. She held out her hand, catching a perfect six-pointed crystal on her palm before it melted from her warmth. "I think I understand now," she whispered. When she returned to the cabin, she found James sitting at the table, a lantern turned low beside him. He looked up as she entered, concern evident in his expression. "Everything all right, Mrs. Thorne? Noticed you were gone." Eleanor unwound her scarf, considering him thoughtfully. "How serious were you about staying in Stonehaven?" His eyebrows rose. Serious enough. Sarah's taken to it here, and Daniel needs stability. He hesitated. But we don't want to impose. We'll figure something out when the weather breaks proper. Eleanor sat across from him, her decision already made, though the words were still forming. This farm needs more than one person to work it properly. Always did, even when Matthew was alive. She met his eyes directly. I'm proposing a partnership. You and your family stay on, help work the land. We split the proceeds. You build your own cabin come spring over by the eastern ridge where the view is best. James stared at her, clearly caught off guard. Mrs. Thorne, that's incredibly generous. It's practical, she corrected him. I'm not getting any younger. This place deserves a future. She paused. And it's Eleanor. If we're to be partners, you should use my name. A slow smile spread across his face. Eleanor, then. I'd need to discuss it with Sarah, but yes, I think we could make that work. The next morning, Eleanor watched from the porch as James gave Sarah the news, saw the younger woman's face light up with relief and hope. Daniel, not understanding the adult's excitement but caught up in it nonetheless, ran in circles around them, trailing laughter in his wake. Martha joined Eleanor, her eyes knowing. You've made a good choice, she said. Have I? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the question. 5 years I've kept to myself, kept this place going through sheer stubbornness. What if I've forgotten how to live with people? Martha chuckled, the sound warm in the cold air. Life isn't something you forget, child. It's something you remember bit by bit when you're ready. Spring came to Stonehaven Valley earlier than usual that year. The snow melted in steady streams that fed the creek running through Eleanor's property, bringing the promise of new growth. The seed wheat from town was planted in furrows turned by both Eleanor's hands and James's, while Sarah started a vegetable garden twice the size of what Eleanor had managed alone. Construction began on the new cabin, with men from town coming to help raise the frame. Eleanor found herself hosting meals for the workers, her table expanded with planks to accommodate everyone. The sound of hammers and saws, of men calling to each other and laughing at jokes, filled her days now, instead of silence. One evening in late April, as green shoots were beginning to emerge in the fields, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the new cabin's half-finished walls with golden light. Daniel played nearby, building a town of pebbles and sticks, completely at home on land that had once seemed to hold only Eleanor's grief. Ellie. Sheriff Wade approached, the hat in hand. Got a moment? She nodded, making room for him on the porch step. Town council wanted me to ask officially, he said, turning his hat brim through his fingers. The school needs a teacher come fall. Mrs. Peterson's expecting, and her husband wants her home after. We thought with your education and all. Eleanor stared at him. You want me to teach? 3 days a week to start. We'd arrange transport. He looked out over the flourishing farm. Seems like you've got enough help here now that you could spare the time, and we all remember how you used to help the Peterson kids with their letters before Matthew died. Before she had withdrawn from everything and everyone. She hesitated, the reflex to decline nearly automatic after so many years of self-imposed isolation. Then she looked at Daniel, who would need schooling himself before long, at the new life taking root all around her. I'll consider. Wade nodded, satisfied. That's all we ask. Later, as stars emerged in the darkening sky, Eleanor sat with Martha on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. In the main room of the cabin, Sarah was teaching James to dance, both of them laughing as he stumbled through the steps. Daniel had fallen asleep on Eleanor's bed, exhausted from a day spent trailing after James and helping with the new cabin. I've been thinking, Martha said finally. Sarah could use her mother's recipe book. It's back in Kansas with my sister, but I could write and have her send it. Eleanor glanced at her. "You're planning to stay too, then?" Martha smiled. "Someone needs to keep an eye on all of you. Besides," she added softly, "I've buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children. At my age, watching a new family grow is a gift I didn't expect." Eleanor followed her gaze to where Sarah and James now stood framed in the window, their shadows merged into one as he held her close. Not her family by blood or marriage, yet somehow hers all the same. "When the blizzard came," Eleanor said slowly, "I thought it would be the end of things. I was nearly out of food, out of hope." She looked at her hands, strong and capable despite everything. "Instead, it brought the beginning." Martha nodded, understanding what Eleanor couldn't quite put into words, how sometimes it takes being stripped to nothing to realize what matters, how the act of giving away your last handful of grain, literally and metaphorically, can return to you 100-fold. In the newly planted fields, the first shoots of wheat reached toward the sky, green and vital with promise. Not just seeds of grain, Eleanor thought, but seeds of possibility, of connection, of home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.